Cavus starts off by saying, "So, Whitworth Thorogood, we have it under good authority that you had worked with Faust Dryden in some capacity, both in your dealings in Falstock and also to the east of your city. Perhaps some dealings at Sagara Cove, the Sanguine Stronghold, etc. Let's start with the Sanguine Stronghold, shall we? And you've talked to Cavus enough, by the way, that you know that, like, he's pretty serious when it comes to lines of Inquisition in particular. He gave you sort of the third degree when you were in that prison of sorts where you first met him, and he was shrouded in darkness, and you're like, who the hell is this guy? But he's serious as a heart attack. So that you do get at least a small amount of delight out of watching him turn this on somebody else, particularly Whitwer. Says, we have documentation here that connects both you to the stronghold as well as Faust Dryden. You had worked with him to secure some cargo in the area. If you would you tell the court about that cargo? And you can see that Whitwer Thorogood is not super thrilled to be here. He has agreed to do so. And that was part of your arrangement with him, so you're not surprised by this fact. But even so, there's just this glimmer that you see of, like, you can see his hands kind of shaking a little bit, like he doesn't want to do this, but he knows he has to. You can see him kind of gritting his face. But eventually he responds, and that snobby voice of his says, yes, well, the Margrave approached me about handling some business in the area. Said it could be lucrative. Said it would be difficult to trace back to me. We see how well that's worked out. But said if I could help facilitate the movement of some cargo for him, that it would be beneficial to me as well, would look favorably upon me down the road. And so I thought, why not? While I'm doing quite well for myself in Falstock, there's always room for growth, always room for new opportunities. So I agreed to do so. You see Cavus kind of slowly just pacing back and forth ahead of the prosecution table. He says, would you care to identify what that cargo was exactly? This is the point where Whitwer kind of like climbs up again. He says, well, you may not believe me if I tell you, but I didn't know at the time that it was people. They were stashed in crates, kept asleep by some means. I never went to the site myself, but from what I hear from the men under my employ, it was people being moved to some other location. I was never privy to know exactly what that location was, but for what little it's worth, and I understand how damning these words are regardless, but once I discovered that, there was no further involvement in such a scheme. I'm sure one time was too many, but even so. Cavus kind of pauses. You can see this just really slight smirk on his face, like he's enjoying this, and he obviously knows the answer to these questions before he asks them, but of course he's just using this to get the witness himself to say them. He says, we also heard about some dealings that you had at a warehouse owned by Faust Dryden in Sagara Cove, a small fishing village on the very east part of this continent. What sort of business was happening there? He says, from what I understand, it was a lot of mechanical parts and gunpowder. Seemed to be bringing them in from elsewhere and then having them carted inland somewhere. My best guess was he was using them for some kind of weapon or large mechanism, but again, I didn't ask too many questions. Figured, well, first of all, the less I knew, the better, and second of all, it wouldn't be wise or prudent to question someone of Faust Dryden's stature. But I did assist him in that cargo as well. Cavus kind of gives him a pointed look at this point, stops pacing. Says, so just to be clear, inside this building, in front of the Empress herself, you had no knowledge that at any point was this cargo alive and being used for something else. And Whitwer says, I don't know if lying would do me any good at this point, but no, I did not know at the time. Found out afterwards, was surprised and a little bit horrified, if I'm being honest. But even so. What?
The eye roll was in character.
Ah.
Yes.
I'm gonna make a slightly too loud scoffing noise when he says that he was bothered by it.
I had no idea.
Also,
I was so surprised.
I don't know if my lightning stuff is magical in nature or not, but if it is, I'm glowing.
It is. But
okay.
the runes do still light up somewhat. There's no sparking from them, but there is just a slight glow they managed to give off despite the presence of this anti-magic field.
I'm that angry.
Yeah. Kavis says, now then, when we spoke before in preparation for the trial, you said there was also another arrangement you had come to in regards to working with Faust Dryden. Could you elaborate on that as well, please? And Whitwer again sort of pauses. At this point, he actually looks over in Faust's direction for the first time. Seems to kind of hesitate for a second.
What does Faust look like? That's what I want to know.
Can we see his face from where we are?
You can kind of get a side profile of sorts. You're kind of like back left. So you can make out like, you know, the side kind of, and maybe an eye, and like you can see the nostrils flare when he gets angry and casts Meteor Swarm. No, that's fine. Don't worry about that. We'll get back to that. So you can see that at the very least, while you can't exactly get a full scope of his facial expressions, at least until he turns more in your direction, he does seem to be just gaze fixed on Whitwer and hasn't really stopped paying attention to him since he entered the room. But he also has really made no motion whatsoever. He hasn't reacted to anything that Whitwer has said, and he hasn't raised any objections or anything to what he has said so far, despite the fact that it doesn't paint the best picture. He's just been staring straight ahead at him. Not unblinkingly, by the way. He's blinking regularly. He's not a freak.
Good.
Or is he? After gathering himself for a second, Whitwer says, well, I reached out to him to see if I could perhaps be of service in ways that didn't involve trafficking humans, and thought maybe I had some information that would be of use to him about his son and his traveling companions and some of the activities they'd been up to recently. I thought perhaps I could leverage that to get in his good graces and secure some other opportunities that also were not so untoward, but he didn't seem all that interested in it for some reason. I'm not really sure why. And at that point, he said he had bigger fish to fry, and I sort of cut off all ties with me. That was about a week or so before his son himself came to arrest me at the Empress's guidance. And here I am now. And the very end of that gives you that familiar sense of, like, I'm above this situation that you're sort of accustomed to with Whitwer. He has been somewhat contrite to this point, but it seems he can't help himself. Some of that just leaks through on occasion. Kavis kind of looks him over, says, and that's all? There's nothing else you care to admit while under oath in the Empress's presence? Whitwer kind of shakes his head slowly, says, no, that's all the dealings with Faust Dryden that I've had. Bad enough as it is, wouldn't you say? Kavis just gives him a pointed look like, it's not my place to say. It should be known to the court that in agreement for this testimony, we have agreed to forgive some of Whitwer Thorogood's involvement. His situation will be sorted out on a later date, and he will no longer be allowed to run the city of Falstock. And you see Whitwer look a little crestfallen at that. This isn't like a surprise to him, but still, just hearing it aloud, in the Empress's presence in particular, given his stature, is sobering. A downer for him. That's all I have, says Kavis. Turns to Faust and he says, your witness. And the courtroom is like deadly silent. People are super interested in what's happening. You occasionally hear like a whisper as people talk amongst themselves, but for the most part, everybody's paying rapt attention to what's going on. And
what is Faust? What is binding him right now?
he has shackles on his arms and wrists as well.
Okay, arms and wrists. Okay.
Yeah.
Because
His arms and ankles. Sorry, his wrists and ankles. Yeah.
Honestly, arms and wrists it wouldn't have surprised me. Just different things. I was gonna just tell Tessian like, I am surprised that they didn't go a little more excessive on binding him. I know it's anti-magic, but this is Faust Dryden we're talking about.
Well, magic can take many forms, but I don't see how it could be more dangerous than any other mage in here, which is to say, useless.
I don't know. If we took away your magic, you'd have some fighting spirit, right?
Sure, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to outmaneuver and what are you going to do against Cavus and all of his men?
He makes me nervous, that's all.
Well, then I suggest you keep an eye on him.
He also has Witwer shaking in his boots. That's my transition back to you, Chris.
Excellent. The perfect segue.
I don't know how you want me to describe a 45-year-old man outmaneuvering an entire courtroom of people with his hands chained together.
He's like those guys who like run like nude on the soccer field and they start getting like chased.
I mean, unless he's gonna pull some like Black Widow nonsense, I don't know what's gonna happen.
Whitwer stands up, his hands shackled. He goes, "Smoke bomb!" Throws it. Nothing happens.
Just starts flipping around in his chair, knocking out Russian mobsters.
It's a Jackie Chan style fight. He's improvising weapons and kicking over the table, breaking off a leg, and
Hey, at
blocking
that
his
point,
back.
your father can leave because I don't want a part of that.
Yeah, we're done. You're free.
Wave him out the door.
He rises out of his seat for the first time, slowly, partly because he is shackled and he's not accustomed to that overall, so he's, making sure he doesn't trip and fall over, because that would be just ludicrous for a man of his stature to look so silly.
Plus, he's old.
He's because he's not 45, he's over 60. Yeah. I know, I'm just kidding.
I don't know how old this man is.
That's true. Rises out of his chair slowly. You can kind of hear the shackles clanging, that just soft sound of metal. Walks out from behind his seat as Cavus has gone back and sat down at the table and kind of like passed a note to his Crusader allies who are helping with this investigation, etc. And so he goes and sits down. Faust, slowly shuffling his feet a bit because of the shackles, makes his way, walks around the table, sort of starts walking towards Witwer. And from your vantage point, since you're not really blocked by the approach of Faust Dryden, you can see that Witwer now seems to sort of be shaking for a different reason. This isn't like balled up fists that are clenched and sort of shaking. This is, I legitimately fear this man, even though I've been assured multiple times that nothing should happen here. Faust just kind of makes this slow, languid pace up to him. Gets within 5 feet or so. Looks over Witwer. Says, "I have no further questions."
I knew it. I love it.
And makes his way back behind his table. Sits down and resumes just staring directly at Witwer from his vantage point on the defense bench. And at that point, because again, I'm not doing dialogue for all these ins and outs, but Cavus tells Witwer that he is no longer needed for questioning, has the guards escort him back out of the building.
Does he look at us before he leaves?
At this point, no. He seems like he's got his gaze averted down to the ground.
Good.
But even as such, you can see him as he passes, because there's not that many seats in here. There's a couple hundred people, but it's not like you're at the front of this box and he's walking down an aisle that's like 55 feet from you. So you can see as his gaze is cast downward that he seems still kind of despondent, but there's also like this relief that you can pick up from his face. And by the way, for the viewers, because I forgot to mention this before we started, I had the group roll a bunch of different skill checks before we started as a group. Some of that's going to be woven into all of this in different spots. I'm not going to go into what happened in all of them or what check was for each one thing, but just know that they actually did some of this in advance to save time in the actual recording. There were 12 checks. They succeeded on 8 of them and failed on 4. To be honest, they rolled like shit, so they were kind of lucky not to have failed more than 4. But there were a couple of timely crits and a couple other things that helped save them. So just so you know, that's a factor in all of this as well that we're not doing during this because I didn't want to just be disrupting the trial every time I turned around. So little details like that, when you go like, what can we see, what are we doing with this stuff, may all be tied to that in some manner or another.
Okay.
So just so the viewers know, that happened right before we went live.
Tessian definitely did not roll like absolute hot horse garbage.
No.
No.
He had that
Would've been better if he
125.
stayed home today.
I had 2 rolls, I think, above 10.
You know what, Tessie? And actually, I heard the trial's tomorrow. You should just stay here.
Sleep in.
Just dead weight. I'm the shackles of this party.
Will we know when it happens? Like, especially if it's one that we succeed in?
No.
Okay.
I can tell you guys about it more afterwards. But
Okay,
in
that
the
works.
moment, yeah. And we can do that on air or off. We'll see. But Cavis next calls Karam Purley to the stand.
Who the fuck?
You guys can make a history check on it, but you wouldn't know who it is.
Okay.
I will tell you, just for your own edification, that this is the individual who passed you a note in Timberbrook.
Oh.
So,
Oh, that thing that we
I
ignored.
think this is the person.
you could have met this particular individual, but you did not. What you see come before you is a person not in shackles, like Whitwer was, but it is a somewhat wizened-looking, as my laptop shuts off, Red Genasi. And as he's introducing himself, he talks about how he's part of the Mages Guild, the Arcane Order. He hails from Calisabia, out in the Alizarin Desert. That's the big city to the south of here. And as such, Cavis sort of goes into his questions for this individual, and you're all sort of like, Now, you knew, obviously, that Cavis and the Crusaders and the Empress were all sort of working on their own angles on this as well, so this isn't, like, shocking that there would be something you didn't know, but it's still of interest because, like, oh, who's this guy? What's this about? And he says, Cavis goes, so we understand that you were looking into Faust Dryden based on a tip your guild received, is that correct? And Karam says, yes, that is correct, yes. Cavis says, could you provide some details to the court on that, if you would? He goes, well, our guild is basically concerned with all sorts of magical elements, and both the natural, the unnatural, making sure the balance stays in place. And as such, we heard from what we believed was a pretty trustworthy source that there was some sort of strange magical effect happening in Timberbrook. It wasn't supposed to be too threatening, but they still suggested we should look into it, since we have a lot of people from the different schools and many who are well read in the different types of magic and the possibilities of what could be occurring. So I spent some time in Timberbrook. Could definitely sense that something was off, but was having a hard time gleaning more information, especially without getting access to House Dryden itself. But even so, I was trying to talk to as many people as I could without raising suspicion. Still, I hadn't made up much ground until the Empress sent word to us that she needed us to investigate something in particular. And Cavis, who's once again kind of just pacing, hands behind his back, just a few steps back and forth, sort of kind of like idly passing the time, says, and what request was that? He says, well, she said that there had been some kind of magical artifact discovered underneath House Dryden, and that perhaps we should look into it further. And upon doing so, we found that it was some kind of effect that was meant to pacify the population of Timberbrook. It was not a dangerous effect, nor a particularly strong one, just one that seemed to make it such that the people who were there had a positive experience while they were. Not to the point of them being docile or obedient, just that they would look upon the place more favorably and enjoy their time there. It was strange, and to be honest, I don't really understand what its purpose might be. And at this point, because I feel like you worked so hard at it, Karash, this might be the explanation as to why the Dragonborn said over and over again that they really were enjoying their life in Timberbrook, and that was part of why they weren't especially eager to leave. Now, as Karen describes this in more detail, this is not something so powerful that it was overriding their wishes, or even necessarily amplifying them, but it was an effect that made it such that if they were liking their life there, they were even more likely to stay and not raise much of a fuss. So as such, when somebody came along with the idea of, hunting down this person or doing this other stuff, that was why, way back when, they were sort of resistant to the idea. Just so you know.
And Tessian just sort of leans back and is just to himself, just sort of like, wow, what a crutch. What kind of leader would need such a thing? And just shakes his head, disappointed in Faustryden.
Disappointed.
Disappointed. That's the best. Kavis says, so in your opinion, what exactly could this have been used for? You mentioned that you weren't certain why someone would put something like this in place, but given that you are an expert in your field, if you had to speculate, and let the court acknowledge that this is speculation, what could that have been there for? And it kind of takes a second to think about it. Says, to me, it was just to keep folks from asking questions. It was just there to be this reinforced idea that everything's great, and by all accounts, even people who don't live in Timberbrook and just work there and were not subjected to the effects long term had positive things to say about their time in Timberbrook. Whatever was happening with Margrave Dryden and his own political and individual aspirations didn't seem to extend to the city that he ran. It was more just to keep the populace happy and out of the way. And again, from what I understand from talking to people in my time there, and also feeling the effects myself on a very limited scale, knowing what they were, but choosing to study them, this was not a powerful magic whatsoever. It was just one that was meant to blanket the city and lightly give the impression that everything's okay and there's nothing to worry about.
Tessian leans over to Isaac and it's just like, to give the impression that your father knows how to run a town.
Clearly, yeah.
A stern nod. And we go back to the... Kava says, one more question then. For someone of Margrave Dryden's considerable magical prowess, are you surprised that there were no other effects in place from your investigation? Was there anything else that you found that seemed out of place? And Karen thinks about it for a second. He says, well, at the request of the Alabaster Cabal, I had a look at the mechanism upstairs that was supposedly guarding Faust Dryden's, I don't know what it was, a laboratory or a study or something of significance. That was an elaborate mechanism. Seemed quite dangerous. I warned them that they should not interfere with it because it was a few different magical effects mixed with technology in a way that I'm not familiar. Technology is by no means my forte, but a very delicate and elaborate contraption that, at least from the magical side of things, I can tell you, was meant to do a considerable amount of harm to anybody who was trying to enter who was not supposed to. But while I find that to be a bit of an extreme measure, at the very least, I don't see anything on the surface that's odd about someone wanting to protect things that are important to them. You can argue to the extent that that protection will be necessary, but it's not an absurd idea on its face. It's just seemed more extreme than usual. During this time, by the way, Faust Dryden's gaze has not left Mr. Purley, but he has still not raised any objections. Continues to just sit and watch quietly.
It's just like my father. Maybe he could have run the town well, but he leaves nothing to chance. Why risk questions being asked when he has a mechanism to squash that?
I suspect he simply needed a front and cared nothing for true leadership.
Yeah, you could say that, but this is like him. He's always been like this. Covering all of his bases even when it seems like he wouldn't need to.
Well, he let you get away.
Yeah, I don't know. Is that sentimentality, or does he have a larger plan? Does he have a larger plan?
Tell me! Tell me! At this point, Cavus says he has no further questions. Turns it over to the defense. This time, Faust Dryden rises slowly out of his chair. Doesn't even step out from behind it. Says, I have no questions for this witness. And sits back down. The next individual... Go ahead.
I'm going to lean into Tessian.
Is he not supposed to defend himself?
Well, he would need something to defend against. I suspect either he doesn't care for these he doesn't think these accusations are important, or he knows he has no way to, well, defend against them.
No, I don't think that's it. I'm doing it. I'm doing the anime thing. That
is the prophecy.
Unfortunately, I think it's because he's not worried one way or the other. If either he knows something will give him a rock-solid defense later, or something's off. That's what worries me.
I am worried that he does not plan on being here very long. I do not know how, but I do not trust that he does not have a plan.
Nor do I. Keep your eyes open.
So
I
Cavus
was not going to sleep.
And it'd be so nice if we could see outside these windows.
It is kind of darker in here than it would have normally been if you guys hadn't put drapes in. So, Karash, if you fall asleep, that's part of why. Yeah, boring. So, Cavus has Karim escorted out, but of course he's not in shackles again. It's just a guard accompanies him. It's procedure. The next individual he calls is I don't want to say a surprise, but it's a bit of a surprise.
It's Grail!
Oh my god!
She comes in, the final countdown's playing.
I've been working
She's
for
playing it
Cavus
herself.
in the earth. Faust in the other dimension.
The other dimension.
Oh, jeez.